Before that time.
The physics behind, for example,
another
the
question
reactions,
people
the
say
reaction to the actual change in mass.
the ultimate question about
During
the
the course of the 7 years in which
ethics and
the book was put together.
Welcome to the Scholars Chair, Dawud. It's good to have you here with us tonight. Dawud, for our audience sake, is the former Imam of the Islamic Society of Southern Prince George's County, and he's also a new author. The title of his book is The Vicar of Authenticity. Dawud, welcome back to sit in the Scholars Chair.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. Dawud, tell me, the book looks great, and we've been showing it to our audience, but I want you all to just get an idea. Vicar of Authenticity, what does it mean, and what was your motivation for writing the book?
Sure. The Vicar of Authenticity means, and the word vicar is an Arabic word that means remembrance or admonition. Mm-hmm. The lexical root meaning of the word vicar means to hit a man on the crotch. Mm-hmm. So it's something that resonates with you and stays with you. Mm-hmm. So the Vicar of Authenticity could be translated, the remembrance of authenticity is the way it could be translated.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Dawud, just for our audience sake, your approach to this book was to take al-Islam, the religion of al-Islam, and use that tradition you're using the tradition, and you're also using as a backdrop Black history, as you have indicated, and some of the notable members in our African American historical narrative were Du Bois and Booker T. Washington and Tubman and Douglass and Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. You're using them as notable figures to make what point?
To make the point that the overall point of the book is that, and getting to your original question, the Vicar of Authenticity, mm-hmm. which could be translated the remembrance of authenticity, is really saying that from an Islamic perspective, mm-hmm. an authentic and true expression of Islam comes from a person's personal and experience, and also the experience of that person's people.
Okay.
There can be, and people do have to struggle with this. There's a conversation right now in a West and in America about what Islam is, what al-Islam is, mm-hmm. what authentic al-Islam is, who speaks for Muslims. I mean, these are various questions, and there's a bit of a discussion in America about what it means to be an authentic Muslim. Do you have to be an Arab or a Pakistani or mm-hmm. Someone from another country? Or if you're from America mm-hmm. and you're from the Black community and you accept Islam, are you authentic as a Muslim?
Yes,
so my book is offered as another voice in the conversation, because I say in the book that I'm proposing that this be read alongside mm-hmm. other conversations that are being had right now mm-hmm. to talk about what are authentic and expressions of al-Islam. I use W.E.B. Du Bois specifically and other Black history figures generally, because I use them as setting the backdrop for the African American or the Black experience, mm-hmm. and I also talk about some of my experiences. So I try to use the Quran. I use the example of the Prophet Muhammad. Mm-hmm. I use the analysis and statements and experiences of scholars and notable figures of Black history mm-hmm. to then try to tell or deliver a treatise on an authentic expression of Islam coming from that experience.
Let's get a little bit about your background a little bit. Where are you originally from?
I'm from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania originally.
Yeah, what part of Philly?
West Philadelphia.
West Philly. And tell me about your educational experience. Where were you educated?
Sure, I was born and raised in Philadelphia. Went to public schools there. Went to Temple University, where I received my Bachelor of Business Administration. Mm-hmm. And then years later, after moving to the Washington, D.C. area, I earned a Master of Business Administration from Averett College. Mm-hmm. As a part of my graduate study and part of my research project, I studied spirituality in the workplace, mm-hmm. which in some ways is similar to the Vicar of Authenticity in that it asks the question from whatever tradition you're from, whether it's Islam, Christianity, Judaism, mm-hmm. and there are certain values that you learn from very specific lessons. How do you bring those lessons, which are intended to teach patience and love and kindness and honesty and integrity, how do you bring those lessons outside of that tradition into the workplace?
Tell me, you're originally from West Philadelphia. How do you? And I assume your family was a Christian family.
I come from a Christian family, yes.
Right. Now, how did you make this migration from Christianity to Islam?
Reading, and really trying to answer for myself the fundamental and sole question that every Muslim has answered by reading the Holy Quran: who is God? And that answer for me was answered most emphatically and definitively in the Holy Quran. So God is Allah, which, as you know, is the Arabic word meaning the being that necessarily exists by himself. It is the term that is loosely translated God. And it's if you're an Arabic-speaking person, whether you're a Muslim, Christian, or you're from the Jewish tradition, you call God Allah. It's different from saying God, because we don't say there's no Allah but Allah. We say there's no object of worship except Allah. So that name is a unique name, and it's also part of the uniqueness of who Allah is. So a lot of my personal quest and study to try to answer for myself who is Allah landed me in the Quran.
So we talked a little bit about you and tell me more about the motivation of the book. I want to kind of get at that and what causes you to write such a splendid text.
Well, thank you for the compliment. The motivation was, a lot of it was my personal journey. I'm at a point in time where I was trying to gather and a lot of the thoughts that I had about Islam over the years that I've studied it. But I'm also aware, as you mentioned, I'm a former imam of the Islamic Society of Southern Prince George's County, and the Islamic Society of Southern Prince George's County is a community that doesn't follow a particular orientation of al-Islam, but we are Quran-centric, and we invite other communities, imams, and scholars into our community so that we can understand their point of view and then try to compare that to our understanding to the Quran. So we try to grow and learn from various points of view. But specifically in the coming out of the black experience and people who accept Islam, there is a discussion about what is the next step, and what should we do, we generally do, and how do we remain relevant, and how do we connect to our culture, at a time when a lot of the leaders are aging. Many of us are concerned about our children, like in many other traditions, and we look around at our community and say, what can we do to be helpful coming from an Islamic perspective? So that I'm offering this as a possible, as part of the dialogue.
What attracted you to Islam? The need to clarify some personal issue with yourself?
That, to know who Allah is. One of the things that led me to...
There's a lot of religions that actually answer that question.
Not as definitively for me as the Quran does.
Okay.
So that's why I've anchored a lot my understanding of the divine and God in the Quran. The other thing is I spent some time studying a lot of African history, and I noticed, and the thing that sort of led me to the Quran initially was that I noticed that when I read, for instance, about the Moors or about Songhay or Timbuktu or the Hausa people or various great African civilizations, I noticed that it was not often mentioned, but that a lot of those were great African Muslim civilizations. Arabic itself is very fundamental to especially West African society. Some scholars have even gone so far to call Arabic the Latin of West Africa. So as I was sort of on this personal quest of trying to figure out who God is, and then reading history and noticed that, I said, well, let me pick up the Quran to see what these folks saw, and then I was moved by it and ultimately accepted Islam and continued my study and quest using the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad as my roadmap.
So what attracted you to Islam initially, of course, was the study of African history, African American history, and then you saw these great noble figures keep popping up that were Muslims. I think we were talking.
I would say that I was asking myself who was Allah, who was God. I was reading a lot of African history, and the two things sort of met. And then I and then I picked up the Quran, and I said, oh, okay. It answered the question for me rather emphatically: who is God? And that the answer resonated me, that there's one God, no partner, no associate, eternal, all powerful, all merciful, all loving, has many, as Allah says in the Quran, has the most wonderful names, which are the attributes. And I could, that definition and that directness resonated with me. So, and it's resonated with me ever since. And the more I study Al-Islam, the more I study the Quran, the more I want to know about it. And I never get tired of it. So it's a completely fascinating venture for me.
When you first shared the title with us, Vicar of Authenticity, I immediately conjured the image that, or at least the idea and concept that if the more a person gets to know God, the greater one is aware of himself or herself. Is that the kind of idea that you're postulating in the book, or no?
Yeah, I don't say it that way, but I would agree with that. Know God, know yourself. Love God, love yourself. I'm not saying that you are God. Some Sufis can get there.
Yeah.
I stop short of saying it quite like that, but I do make the argument that one of the fundamental understandings of the way Allah works is that everything is created with a concept called measure. Everything is created with a specific purpose. There's a reason that you're here. And so part of authenticity and identity is accepting where you are, but then growing from that place as you grow closer to God by trying to embrace and imbibe the attributes that are reflected in, I argue, in Allah's names and attributes, having to do with love, mercy, kindness, being more patient. A lot of that has to do with following the sunnah or the example of the Prophet Muhammad, who is our first example of those attributes. And I also make the argument that dhikr also has the connotation in some societies or some cultures of various rituals having to do with reciting Allah's names or certain ritual dances. I say that, I make the argument that part of the dhikr is really to understand who you are as a base person, to understand why you are not able to forgive, why you're not able to be merciful, why you're not able to be just or fair. What is, Allah says in the Quran, what has seduced you away from the path of Allah? What has diverted you from this path? And I argue that you should look to yourself to ask yourself that question, understand what Allah has revealed in the Quran, and try to get yourself back on that path. And while you're doing that, don't separate yourself from who you are, from your people, from your society, from your culture, and try to be a help in that, because actually part of the answer is in that work.
It should be a contributing member to the community.
Society. One of the overarching, as I understand it, one of the overarching messages of Al-Islam is to believe in Allah and to work righteousness, or believe in Allah and do good. Believe in Allah and work for the common good. So I kind of like Booker T. Washington says, I make the argument: lower your buckets, start with yourself, and start working there from the inside out.
Well, it's one of my favorites.
And that's why I said that.
Tell me, how are you using Du Bois in your text? Because you introduced a number of places, the quotations of Du Bois.
Yeah, Du Bois has always been a personal favorite of mine, and I discovered Du Bois as I was trying to write this book, actually. And actually, this book is not the book I started to write. I actually started to write a larger book called The Next Wave, Black American Muslims at the Intersection of Destiny and Opportunity. That book was very complicated for me, so I had to pull back a little bit and try to come up with a focus, what I call a preface or prologue, which is this book. And as we've talked about, I use, part of being authentic is calibrating or making sure that your understanding of God is consistent with the strivings of your people. Yeah. And so I use W.E.B. Du Bois, who is preeminent. I mean, say what you want to say about him, but he's preeminent in terms of African American intellectuals for the 20th century, and who spent close to 80 years or more, really, I would say, fighting the intellectual jihad to resolve Negro problems. I kind of say that in the book.
I was going to ask you, do you have a favorite quote?
Wow. I don't know if I can use one, but one that I do use his concept of double consciousness. there's so many things that, I mean, you have literally from, Du Bois was born about 5 years after the Civil War and died on the eve of the March on Washington. So there's so many, you almost have to compartmentalize what period you want to pull from.
Yeah.
But the idea of double consciousness I do use in the book. The idea of looking at yourself through the lens of others. Now he's using that concept in The Souls of Black Folk, and even an essay that was written before that called The Strivings of the Negro People. He's using that concept to really explain to predominantly a white audience what it's like to live on what he calls the other side of the veil, to live in the black world, separated by segregation and Jim Crow and other things, but always being forced to measure yourself by the perspective of someone else. So that concept of double consciousness, of not really what I'm arguing in the book, and what actually Du Bois advocates, to really be true to yourself, to be true to your values, to be true to your God. I mean, even though Du Bois is complicated in terms of his religious belief, and some people say he was an atheist, some people say he was agnostic. He's a little vague about it during his life, but that's probably another conversation. But I do use him and his writings and some of those concepts as the backdrop for at least a perspective on the black experience, and a lot of the ideas about double consciousness, to make the argument that Allah argues that Allah created you specifically, created you perfectly, created your hues and colors and languages and the variety of the creation, and you should embrace that. And as we all draw nearer to Allah, because in Islamic theology, we believe that we're all created by Allah, we'll all taste death, we'll all be raised, but as you're in this journey, in this life, you should be constantly moving in a way that moves your psyche, moves your consciousness, moves your spirituality towards the higher values of what Allah has revealed in the Quran, and I keep saying by His name, and also best represented by the best example of the Prophet Muhammad. So I try to weave those arguments together. The other reason I use Du Bois is that I believe that the formative period of African American Islam was the period of time that Du Bois was conducting what I call his intellectual jihad to resolve Negro problems. During the 20th century, largely urban, largely northern. So I use it as a baseline, because there isn't a subject that isn't plaguing the black community in some level now that he hadn't thought about, wrote about, and has something to say. You don't necessarily have to agree with it, And of course, we know about his debates with Booker T. Washington and Marcus Garvey, and he was critical of the civil rights movement with Martin Luther King, but Du Bois is there.
I'm very interested in because I've read quite a bit about Du Bois, and I do appreciate the idea of double consciousness. I'm just very curious in your own spiritual journey, whether the Islam actually informs you of African American history, or African American history informs you of Islam. How do you reconcile that? You're talking about using a system of values and of religion to evaluate history. Tell me how this sort of gets to the heart of one of the reasons that I wrote the book, and an issue that at least a lot of my associates in the Black American community are concerned about, is that how do you stay true to your culture as you accept and practice al-Islam? And one of the things that makes this complicated is that oftentimes some of the books and some of the teachers of al-Islam who are considered authentic and credible and valid are in fact not teaching al-Islam. Right. They are teaching a version of al-Islam that may have worked, and that may work for them, may work for their culture, may work for their time, place, and circumstance. Do you have an example?
Not a specific.
What comes in my mind is the Nation of Islam, but
I wouldn't use the Nation of Islam. The Nation of Islam, actually, the Nation of Islam, I would say is a necessary step towards authentic Islam. Okay. I see it the exact opposite probably than you do.
No,
I see that as a necessary.
I'm just trying to fill in the blank where you were making.
But I would say that there are some versions of al-Islam that are considered authentic that are simply rooted in another culture, in another time, and that are really reflective of another time and culture. If you take what is essential for al-Islam and the belief in Allah, and you accept that you start with the 5 pillars of al-Islam as explained by the Prophet Muhammad, belief in Allah and the prophethood of Prophet Muhammad, and prayers 5 times a day, and giving regular zakat, which means, it's translated charity, but it really means purity and increase, and you fast during the month of Ramadan and make pilgrimage once in your life, and then you take the moral values that are very clearly articulated in the Quran, and start there. It may not look like somebody who's practicing Islam from Bangladesh or Saudi Arabia or any other place in the Muslim world that are seen as authentic.
Right.
And when you read various scholars of al-Islam, they all say that time and place, context are important in the propagation of al-Islam. And so part of the thing, and I'm not the only one saying this, I just say it from my perspective.
Right.
But part of what I've said in the book is that a valid expression of al-Islam might not look like what is considered valid or authentic al-Islam.
Well, you have multiple cultures.
Because you have multiple cultures,
right?
You have multiple cultures.
Yeah, just about every culture in the world is practicing Islam, and you're correct. The Russians will not be wearing desert dress, for example, which make perfect sense to me. But I was curious about what might be authentic Islam. What is? I mean, it is a religion. It has a particular source, being the Quran itself. It has a patriarch, which is the Prophet, and it's no better Muslim than Prophet Muhammad. May God's peace be with the Prophet. What does that mean to you? What is authentic Islam?
I would sum it up by belief, a clear, unequivocal, uncompromised belief in the uniqueness of Allah, meaning one unique deity, exclusive of any other concept of God. And then being true to who you are, being true to your people, and then growing your Islam from there within a moral framework of the Quran. What that looks like will depend on those people. Will depend on those people, and it may not look like, oftentimes it won't, especially in the West. It won't look like an Islam in, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, various other places. There will be elements, that look the same. But after all, we're on another part of the world. We're taking our understandings from this context. And Allah says in the Quran that the entire earth is a masjid. Now I've always understood that to mean that the entire earth is appropriate to grow Islam. And this actually raises. You can even use examples of Islamic architecture. Early Muslims, when they went to various places, did not import the architecture from a place. They used local materials, and they developed masjid architecture using local materials because from the same concept that the entire earth is a masjid, and Allah made everything. Allah didn't just make one set of people and one particular expression of al-Islam. He made. There's one God in many people, and many people have the opportunity to shed the things that really would be detrimental to the culture, or that might be considered immoral, but that are aligned with the values that Allah has outlined in the Quran.
Let me ask you, can I ask you to turn the mirror or turn the lens for me and put yourself in the position of another culture looking at the African American Muslim? What lesson would you think that they will learn by this study?
One advantage that we have, part of the, not that all African Americans are descendants of slaves, but the Atlantic slave trade is a critical part of Black history. But that process really gleaned out a lot of the culture that we used to have as Mandingos or Hausas or Ibus or whatever, the multiple tribes that we came from, primarily from West Africa. So we are stripped of a lot of cultural baggage that now should allow us to accept the teachings of the Quran fresh and new. And one of the things that I've had conversations with a lot of people from other countries and cultures can't tell the difference. They simply can't tell the difference because they've been doing it for so long between the Quran, the life of the Prophet Muhammad and the rulings of the various scholars over 1,000 years, and they kind of wrap all this up into one big ball called Islam. But they don't really know, and they're not really sure, and they don't have the confidence to do some things and not others, or put some things down. And frankly, it's a problem that's weighing down the Muslim world. I mean, if you look at the Muslim world objectively and not in a romantic way, it's not, the Muslim world is not leading the world as envisioned in the Quran in most things that are progressive and modern and advancing civilization.
So they may be able to examine a community and rediscover the tradition of the Prophet because of this stripping away of prior culture.
If they're open to it. One of the arguments I make in the book is that, and I don't use the term immigrant Muslims.
Right.
I purposely did not use that term immigrant Muslims because, frankly, we have multiple second and third generation Muslims who happen to be from the countries that we've named. They're just as American as we are.
Yes,
so
yes,
I do sort of make the argument that those of us who've been true to our culture and not accepted, I'll say it accidentally, the culture of another people as they transmitted Islam to us.
Right.
And the children of those immigrants, I think that's where the conversation will be about what Islam will be here in America.
That's very clear. I hope that a lot of people will pick up on that and know the distinction between culture and the religion. And you keep making that point, that there is a distinction. Tell me.
Well, I would say that in some ways, and some of the scholars say that where there's not specific guidance, the culture fills in. And so the thing is, there is a culture here in America.
Yes.
The thing I argue against is don't import another culture because it's not specifically mentioned in the Quran. The culture we have is created by Allah also. And so to jettison our culture for various reasons, people do this, consciously or unconsciously, is actually contrary to what Allah has revealed in the Quran.
We are getting down to the last few minutes of our program, but I wanted to ask you, the young person who might be African American, who's going to college and perhaps looking at Islam, what would you encourage the takeaway from reading your book would be?
In some ways, we said it earlier, know yourself, know God. Right. Ask the question, because in our community, the Islamic side of Southern Prince George's County, we do ask the question of any sheikh, any imam, and we invite many imams in, we ask them, where is that in the Quran? Where is that in the life of the Prophet Muhammad? What was the time, place, and circumstance for that revelation and that action, and then we'll determine if that's applicable. And we'll determine that for ourselves. And that's what I would tell anybody trying to accept Islam today.
So, in other words, go to the original sources.
This is, Allah said, this is a religion. This is a book, the Quran. This is a religion for those who think, consider, and reflect. This is a religion where you simply don't have to separate your intellect from your faith, and we should not substitute that for someone else's reasoning. Their reasoning may be fine, but I see it as data that we should consider as we develop our own methodology.
Perfect. You know, I've enjoyed this discussion, Dawud, and I think that the book is well written. I think that people will benefit from reading it. We've been looking at manuscripts for at least a year. And I greatly appreciate the effort. I think that you have done a great service to readers. And so thank you for coming in and sharing that with us today. Just a quick question to you. What book would you recommend as a student to read?
Other than this one? The Holy Quran. The Quran. As a matter of fact, my hope is that when people read this book, they will consider reading the Quran.
Reading the Quran.
Yes.
That's marvelous. Well, that is another Scholars Chair. We've been talking to Dawud Abdur-Rahman. He is a new author of a book titled The Vicar of Authenticity. You should go out and give it a read. That is another Scholars Chair. If you want to check out the Scholars Chair online, you can go to Read One channel on YouTube, or you can just shoot me an email at thescholarchair@gmail.com. I'm Khalil Shadid. Good night.
amazing.